Talk about something a little bit different today. So I want to talk about what I call innovation corruption. And I want to give you a sense of what I mean by innovation corruption by saying what it's not first. So what I don't mean by innovation corruption is something like the idea evoked by a man like Blagojevich. Right? I'm not talking about any act that you could think of as bribery. Indeed, not any violation of any existing rules. Instead, what I mean by innovation corruption is a certain kind of influence, an influence within an economy of influence that has a certain effect. It's innovation corruption, in the sense that I mean it here, if it weakens the opportunity for innovation, especially by weakening the ability to challenge dominant players. That's what I mean by innovation corruption. Okay, so you could identify a number of sources for this kind of corruption. I want to talk about just one. The source I want to talk about is this institution, the United States Congress, and the way that the Congress becomes a means to buy protection against competition. So this story is told fantastically in this new book by Robert Kaiser, book So Damn Much Money. Kaiser describes in this book the way the economy of Washington has been changed as the architecture of lobbying within Washington has changed just over the past 25 years. So he describes here an economy that has a number of elements. There are lobbyists who are in the business of benefiting members so that members can benefit interests, and so those interests can benefit the lobbyists. Each of these elements pays the other. Each has become dependent upon the other. So think about the way lobbyists pay members. Lobbyists pay members during and after their time in Congress. During their time in Congress, lobbyists pay members with cash. And I don't mean the brown paper bag version of cash. I mean instead support for the campaigns that members of Congress have to wage for themselves or their party to get back to power. As the cost of campaigns has gone through the roof, members have become increasingly dependent upon lobbyists as sources for their campaign funds. So if they spend between 30 and 70% of their time as members raising money to get into Congress or to support their party's return to Congress, lobbyists become suppliers, or to push the metaphor just a little bit, they become pushers inside this economy of influence and dependence. Now this, as Kaiser describes, is something new. As he puts it, money has been part of American politics forever, on occasion in the Gilded Age or the Harding administration, for example, much more blatantly than recently. But the scale of it has just gotten way out of hand. The money may have come in brown paper bags in earlier eras, but the politicians needed and took much less of it than they take through more formal channels today. So compare, for example, this man, Max Baucus, senator from a state that represents 0.3% of the American population. Arguably, Baucus was the most important senator in the course of the healthcare reform debate. While he was chairing the committee that would control what came out of the Senate, he opened his coffers to more than $4 million in contributions from the very interests he would be regulating. Compare Baucus with this man, John Stennis, senator from Mississippi, no choir boy Stennis, but when he was head of the Armed Services Committee in the early 1980s, Stennis was asked by a colleague to hold a fundraiser for defense contractors. And John Stennis' response was, "Would that be proper? I hold life and death over these companies. I don't think it would be proper for me to take money from them." So Kaiser's point is that this ethic of self-restraint that was even present in the early 1980s by one of the most powerful men in the United States Senate is completely gone from Congress today. The idea that you would not trade your power in your committee into campaign contributions by those who actually are subject to your regulation is completely naive in the course of Congress's life today. So that's during the time in Congress, the way members get paid by lobbyists, and then afterwards. Lobbyists pay members with their future. As my friend Jim Cooper, a congressman from Tennessee, puts it, Capitol Hill is increasingly a farm league for K Street. Increasingly, members and staffers and bureaucrats have a common business model, a business model focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. So Public Citizen estimated that 50% of senators between 1998 and 2004 left the Senate to become lobbyists, 42% of the House, so that everyone depends upon this existing system surviving. And in that way, through this payment for life after Congress, lobbyists pay members. And then members pay interests through the policies that get changed, sometimes extraordinarily profitably. So this University of Kansas study estimated that the return on investment for the lobbyists' cost to get an amendment to the American Jobs Creation Act was 22,000%, leading many businesses to think it's much more profitable to invest in changing policy in Washington than to invest in some great new innovation outside of Washington. Or this paper just published in the American Journal of Political Science last year estimated that for large companies lobbying on tax changes, for every $1 spent, they could lower their taxes between $6 and $20 because of the special favors they got inside of targeted tax benefits. So sometimes profitably, sometimes brazenly. So the New York Times in February had this story about Chuck Schumer going back to Wall Street to raise money for the Democratic Party and facing an extraordinarily angry Wall Street. As the Times put it, city's titans of finance at a recent closed-door meeting accused him, Schumer, of being insufficiently pro-Wall Street. One indignant fellow stood up and demanded his donation back. Now remember, this is Chuck Schumer. There is no man in the United States Senate more responsible for turning over complete regulation of Wall Street to Wall Street, but even this man is insufficiently pro-Wall Street for Wall Street. And that power begins to have an interesting effect. Now, these are the top 10 hedge fund managers of last year. If I asked you here what their average income was last year, each of these hedge fund managers, their average income, what would you guess? Somebody,
20 million.
20 million?
50.
50.
1 billion.
1 billion? You laugh, but you're low. $2.5 billion in average income for these top 10 managers. Okay, because of the way they structure their income, what's the tax on that $2.5 billion?
Please don't tell us.
15%, capital gains tax. Now, when Obama came to office, he said, this is ridiculous. We need to change this so that they at least pay what we all pay for income, ordinary tax gain on this income. So he took this idea to Capitol Hill. Democrats on Capitol Hill said, absolutely not. We are not going to get these guys angry at us by raising their taxes, by closing this loophole. So that reform, like many other reforms of Wall Street, has died. Okay. And then this is the part that's most important to the story I want to tell you. They also enable these changes to protect themselves. Okay, so here's an example a little far from your field, but then I want to focus on one right in your field. Think about the sugar industry. There are basically 6 manufacturers of sugar in the United States. They have achieved an enormous political gain by getting tariffs that block the import of sugar, except for 15% of American consumption. That costs the American people $3 billion every year in increased prices to give them a benefit of $1 billion. So it's a $2 billion loss in wealth to our society. One of the biggest beneficiaries of this is also one of the largest campaign contributors in the United States, ADM. They like this not because they produce sugar, but because they produce lots of corn. You think, why do they care about sugar subsidies if they're producing corn? Well, the answer, of course, is if sugar is expensive, then this thing that you can't help but consume every morning, every day of your life, high fructose corn syrup, is cheap. And indeed, it's cheap to about 50% cheaper than sugar to put high fructose corn syrup. Well, why is corn syrup so cheap? It's cheap because ADM and others have succeeded in getting an enormous amount of corn subsidies, $75 billion subsidizing corn production over the last 15 years, which lowers the cost of corn below the cost of production and drives an enormous amount of our food economy towards corn-based consumption, including meat, which you've seen Food Inc., which describes the extraordinary cost to our society because of that shift. All of this produced by lobbyists shifting the focus of politicians in ways nobody went to Washington to pursue. No Republican or Democrat decided they were going to run for Congress because they wanted to benefit the largest food producers in the United States. That's not why you go to Congress, yet that's precisely what they do. Or think about this in the context of something you care about a lot, broadband. As everyone here knows, the United States is a broadband-challenged nation. All the recent surveys demonstrate that we are at least 15th to 17th in these aggregate scoring relative to our competitors around the world in broadband service. Now, you're too young to remember this, most of you, but it wasn't always like this, right? We were at a certain point in the history of the internet #1 in the provision of these services. In the 1990s, the United States had literally thousands of ISPs providing narrowband dial-up service. There was enormous competition. Now, why was there that competition? Well, it actually has nothing to do with the internet. It has to do instead with this company, MCI. MCI has a certain story. All stories begin like this. Once upon a time, there was a company, AT&T, went through a couple of versions of its life. But in all of these early stages of its life, AT&T was a state-sanctioned monopoly. AT&T owned its platform, and what the government said was that that meant it got to control its platform. Indeed, it got to control innovation on its platform. So for example, this technology, something called the hushaphone, that was a piece of metal sitting on top of an early telephone, a device to make it so that you could quiet the telephone conversation and hear much more clearly what was being said on the other end. This technology was introduced in 1948 and quickly got the ire of AT&T and got AT&T to go to the government to get the government to ban the technology. As AT&T said, the use of a hushaphone affects more than the conversation of the user. Its influence pervades the whole telephone system. What was its influence? The idea that it would encourage people to innovate in ways that AT&T did not control. The government agreed with AT&T because AT&T at that time was the favored monopoly. It was the apple pie monopoly. It was the everyone loves monopoly. It was the stable, functional, popular monopoly. Oh, sorry, not that one. This one. And it was rooted on by the government for most of the life of that monopoly. But then things changed. The monopoly became a disfavored monopoly. And this was the technology that first began to trigger that, the Carter phone technology, which was a device to make it so that you could basically broadcast music throughout a telephone system. The DC Circuit, when AT&T challenged this, said that AT&T must allow the attachment of devices on their network that it didn't harm the network. So long as you could demonstrate it was not going to harm the network, you had to allow the attachment. You could not discriminate against people who wanted to make such attachments. And it was because of that rule that MCI could get born. Because MCI began to attach a bunch of microwave technologies to the network to enable long-distance competition that didn't exist there before, these attachments enabling cheap long-distance service, which AT&T, of course, fought. Because now they were really fighting not the esoteric question of whether you could have a quiet telephone that the hushaphone had, but this was their lifeblood. AT&T's dependence on long-distance fees was a core part of their monopoly power, and if MCI could take that away with cheaper long-distance service, they were really in trouble. But at this point, the public began to poison their support by seeing AT&T fight against lower prices. So in 1982, Ronald Reagan's Justice Department sued to break up the AT&T monopoly, and a consent decree was entered to facilitate that breakup, and AT&T was divided into a bunch of baby bells. Now, the principles that they were told to live under were two. Number one, non-discrimination, and number two, unbundling. So non-discrimination meaning you couldn't discriminate against people that wanted to do things to your wires as long as it didn't hurt the network. And unbundling here means you had to give access to your customer to the competitors. Right? And that made narrowband ISPs possible because number one, it allowed modems. AT&T originally said you can't try to trick our network into speaking computer to computer because we don't allow it. But under the principle of Carter phone, I should be allowed to connect a modem to your network, even if it competes with you in some sense, because it's not hurting your network. And AT&T was not allowed to discriminate against people who used modems on the network versus people who just spoke on the network. That discrimination was banned, and therefore people could use the network to create a layer on top of the network that was the internet. And because ISPs could also get access to customers on those wires, competition in ISPs flourished, and there were thousands of ISPs. Okay, but that was narrowband. The 1996 Telecommunications Act tried to extend that to broadband as well. And the principles of this earlier era were embodied in the 1996 Act, non-discrimination and unbundling. But it's the government, so they were implemented inconsistently. So these are the 6 titles of the Communications Act. Title II, covering DSL, is governed by the telecommunications rules of non-discrimination and access to the customer. But cable was not regulated by those principles. So DSL had open access rules, meaning DSL providers could get access to the customer across the telephone lines, but there was no similar right in the context of cable. And that led to what happened in the late 1990s called the open access wars. Baby bells had to unbundle, but cable companies did not. And between 1997 and 2000, there was a policy war as the baby bells tried to get Congress to impose on cable companies the same rules for open access that the baby bells themselves faced. So they wanted to see a world where there'd be competition among lots of ISPs for DSL and lots of ISPs for cable. Well, the court, December 12, 2000, resolved this question when the court decided who would be the next president of the United States in Bush v. Gore. And George Bush appointed a head of an FCC who started a process to reclassify in the context of DSL and cable, to say that both of these were what's called information services, meaning that the old principles of non-discrimination and access no longer would apply to either of them. There would be no regulation required for either DSL or cable, so that there would be no mandated competition or non-discrimination in either of those two broadband platforms. And in 2005, the Supreme Court upheld that reclassification. So there's no open access rule for any broadband service in the United States. Now, amazingly, the world didn't follow us in that change. In 1996, the world embraced the rule we announced in 1996, open access. Japan, France, Korea, United Kingdom, Germany, all of them began to regulate their networks according to the old rule that we used to regulate AT&T, open access. So we had an experiment here. The USA had unregulated broadband access. Broadband providers could do what they wanted. There was no rule for competition, but the rest of the world, or the relevant part of the world, had open access requirements. Now, when I look at this debate, I begin to feel like a little bit like an old man in this debate, because I feel like I've seen this whole cycle, and I feel like I'm tired and exhausted by this debate. But I remember a decade ago having this argument with somebody about whether these open access rules made sense. And at the end of our argument, the person I was arguing with, who supported abolishing the open access rules, said, we're going to have a natural experiment here. We'll see which works better, open access or the unregulated platform. And what we need to recognize is that experiment is now over. Barack Obama, of course, came to office saying broadband would be a key to economic growth. He charged the FCC and the chairman of the FCC, Julius Janikowski, with providing a national broadband plan that would get us to world competitive levels with broadband. The FCC commissioned a study to figure out what the rest of the world's doing, a review of internet transitions and policy from around the world, a study completed at the Berkman Center at Harvard, and I need to make an important disclosure. I don't have anything to do with the Berkman Center anymore, but the author of this study is a person who I think is the brightest person studying these issues ever. Well, Adam Smith was pretty good too, but in a long time, Yochai Benkler. Okay, so Benkler conducted this worldwide study of this issue, and the results were really astonishing. The findings were, number one, differences were huge around the world. So, for example, take France. France, right? We're not talking about Korea or Japan, where people think they have weird physics in those countries that make things work better. No, we're talking about France, right? This is France. For $33 a month, this is what you get in France. 20 megabit broadband, HD TV, unlimited long distance and international telephone calling in 70 countries, and in various hotspots around the country, free wireless throughout France. That's $33 a month. That's a product of enormous competition in the access to broadband services brought about through regulations like the open access regulations we used to have. And as the Berkman study concludes, open access here explains the differences. The lowest prices and highest speeds are almost always offered by firms in markets where, in addition to an incumbent telephone company and a cable company, there are also competitors who entered the market and built their presence through the use of open access facilities. Okay, so we had this experiment where basically the world's the same until around 2000, where the world's broadband performance skyrockets and ours declines. The key difference here is government policy. The National Broadband Plan is addressing government policy. So how did the National Broadband Plan incorporate this important insight about what explains the success of the rest of the world? How did they respond? I mean, we ran the experiment, regulation versus deregulation. The data demonstrate we were wrong, right? And of course, Obama comes from the reality-based community. I remember during the Bush administration, a Bush official said, "You believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality? That's not the way the world really works anymore." Well, the Obama administration was committed members of the reality-based community, right? That's how they were going to do policy. So how did they accommodate this reality presented by this extraordinary study of worldwide practices? They ignored it. The FCC study, conclusion, broadband report, cites the study once, a study they commissioned, and the word open access is mentioned nowhere in the study. So why is that? As one reporter put it, senior commission staff members have essentially conceded that lobbying pressure from the monopolies is too strong to even begin exploring open access right now. As The Economist put it in a very stinging editorial, almost uniquely among OECD countries, America has adopted no open access requirements. America relies almost exclusively on facilities competition, the provision of rival infrastructures. True, there's a legitimate worry that forcing a company to rent out parts of its infrastructure to competitors may deter investment. But a review of international broadband policies prepared by the Berkman Center revealed a range of successful compromises in use in other countries. The FCC has availed itself of none of them. If America's facilities-based system were really working, the country would at the very least, enjoy first-rate broadband in dense urban areas where providers are most likely to recoup their investments quickly. Yet in February, the Said Business School at Oxford and Universidad of Oviedo released a study that produced a broadband quality score based on bit volume and speed matched against current and probable future applications. Chicago, America's best performing city, ranked 26th, below Sofia and Bucharest. No American city was judged ready for tomorrow. Among countries, America ranked 16th, which is roughly where it falls almost any available measure of broadband penetration or quality, and that's not good enough, the economist said. Now, why is this the policy? It's the policy because what's right in DC is a function of what's politically possible, where politically possible doesn't mean what the voters actually want. I don't see many voters marching on the streets saying we shouldn't have fast broadband in the United States. It's because of the power of incumbents to block political reform. That's the way members pay the interests. And then the interests pay the lobbyists. As Kaiser puts it, in earlier generations, enterprising young men came to Washington looking for power and political adventure, often with ambitions to save or reform the country or the world. In the last fourth of the 20th century, such aspirations were supplanted by another familiar American yearning to get rich. So as he describes this industry, which is about the size of the American recording industry, it has produced enormous wealth for lobbyists. So this man, the man who invented the way earmarks get used, Gerald Cassidy, has amassed a fortune of $100 million from his practice of lobbying. And as lobbying has become so wealthy, Washington has radically changed from a kind of hick town of the 19th century to one of the wealthiest cities in the country. Now, the top 7 counties are around Washington, D.C., as people realize that the business of selling policy is enormously lucrative. So lobbyists pay members, members pay interests, interests pay the lobbyists. It is an economy. Yet, the politicians deny that the economy has any effect. As one congressman told me, it's ridiculous to suggest that the money changes results. Maybe it affects access. As this congressman put it, people who contribute get the ear of the member and the ear of the staff. They have the access, and access is it. Access is power. But as I was told, it doesn't change results. Now, I find this pretty hard to believe, at least if you want to be charitable in interpreting what Congress does, right? Because there's a whole host of these easy cases which, the kind of 2 + 2 = 4 cases of government, which our government just gets wrong, right? So take one issue that I fought for many years, copyright. I became an activist in this space on October 27th, 1998, when our Congress passed a bill honoring this great American, Sonny Bono, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, which extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. Now, of course, the question Congress was supposed to ask when they passed that statute was, could it make sense from a public policy perspective to advance the term of an existing copyright? Because, of course, a copyright is about creating an incentive, and at least in this universe, incentives are prospective only. No matter what Congress does, George Gershwin is not going to produce anything more. So could it make sense to extend the term of existing copyright? Well, when we challenged the statute in the Supreme Court, this liberal economist, that's Milton Friedman, right-wing Nobel Prize winning economist, said he would sign our brief alleging there could be no possible public policy benefit, only if the word no-brainer was in the brief somewhere. But apparently there were no brains in this place when they passed this statute overwhelmingly with 2 congressmen voting against it, because here's an easy public policy question which Congress just got wrong. Or think again in the context of nutrition, there's a consensus among people who know something about it that we eat too much of this stuff, not enough of this stuff. 2003, World Health Organization decided they tried to advance public policy on the basis of this consensus. They said that no more than 10% of your daily caloric intake should come from added sugar. Well, the sugar industry was not happy with this. They went ballistic about that recommendation. They got the United States Senate to threaten to withdraw funding from the WHO if they didn't back down from their crazy suggestion. What they wanted was the WHO to recommend that 25% of your daily caloric intake should come from added sugar. Well, the WHO didn't back down, but our government did. In 2003, the Food Nutrition Board promulgated standards suggesting that 25% of your daily caloric intake could come from added sugar. So here's a balanced diet according to our government. You can start with Fruit Loops or M&Ms for breakfast, a glass of milk, a cheeseburger for lunch, pizza, indeed 3 slices of pepperoni pizza, and sugar cookies for dessert for your dinner. That's a balanced diet according to our government. Once again, an easy public policy question, which our government just gets wrong. Or think most profoundly right now about financial services. There's a fantastic book everyone should read, 13 Bankers, talking about the current crisis and how we got to it. Here's a kind of short version of it. There was a depression. Things were really, really bad. And after the Depression, the government recognized that it had an important policy to pursue in the context of financial services. A very simple principle of oversight, at least in the context of fundamental regulation of the economy. So every single major instrument of financial services, from bonds to stocks to savings, would in a certain sense be supervised, or you could say regulated, at least in the sense that these simple principles would apply. There would be public trading on publicly registered markets. The trades would be transparent, and there would be anti-fraud requirements imposed upon these trades. In the 1990s, there was some radical new innovation in thinking about financial services. The core of that innovation was we need to deregulate these industries. These new instruments that these financial services companies were developing should instead be privately regulated. So these requirements of public, transparent, anti-fraud requirements became non-public, non-transparent, no anti-fraud requirements required for these instruments. Now, sometimes we don't have a good sense of the scale here. So I asked one of the economists writing about this, Frank Partnoy, to put the numbers together. And he said, well, in 1980, almost 100%, maybe 2 or 3%, he said, of the financial instruments that people were traded over the counter, meaning outside of this regulated space that required transparency, that required disclosure, that required that the anti-fraud requirements apply. But by 2008, literally 90% of instruments were exempted from these regulatory requirements, and just 10% of the instruments being traded on our marketplace were subject to these core regulatory requirements. Producing, of course, the bubble that exploded and brought down a big chunk of the American economy. But of course, that change wasn't enough for Wall Street. They didn't just want deregulation, they also wanted a certain re-regulation. And the regulation they wanted was a government guarantee that when these bubbles burst, there would be a bailout for them. And as the book 13 Bankers describe, there was an extraordinary series of political deals through which they got that guarantee, producing, of course, what Krugman and others have referred to as the modern version of American capitalism: socialized risk, but privatized benefit. They got all the benefit, but we, society, covered the risk. Now, from a public policy perspective, this is insanely stupid. So why is it we followed this insanely stupid public policy? You tell me, here are the numbers, the fastest growth in campaign contributions in any sector over the past 20 years has been in the context of financial sector and securities sector, again, producing easy public policy questions which our government just gets wrong. Now, the point in all of these cases is the government's getting these questions wrong either because they're idiots or because they're guided by something other than reason. And my own view, I know this is controversial, but my own view is they are not idiots. It's not stupidity that's leading them to do what they do here. And it's not just in easy cases which they're following what is, in any objective sense, senseless policy. It's everywhere inside of what our government does. Policy gets bent to those who pay, and with the consequence that public trust is weakened in this institution. The vast majority of Americans believe money buys results in Congress. In this district, it's close to 88% of Americans believe money buys results in Congress, producing an institution which now less than 23%, it's 22.4% in the latest poll, have any faith or confidence in this institution answering the troubles which face the nation. Indeed, arguably, there were more people at the time of the Revolution who favored the British Crown than who favor our Congress today. This institution then produces enormous cynicism about government and using government to solve public problems. That's the source of the kind of innovation corruption I want you to focus on. Now, my claim is this economy has an effect. It weakens the opportunities for innovation by weakening the ability to challenge dominant players. How does it do that? Well, the power that gets deployed in the context of Washington Day is a power deployed to protect a status quo. Which status quo? It's the status quo that is successful with the particular mix of regulation that we have right now. And what is this mix? I mean both this much regulation and this little regulation. So this much regulation, think about this story that was told to me by a former chief staffer of Al Gore. Al Gore, when he was vice president, had the idea of getting an amendment to the Communications Act to add a new title to the Communications Act. So Title II regulated telecom, Title VI regulated cable. Gore's idea was to create a Title VII that would take the internet-related or broadband-related components and put it under a new title, and that new title would be fundamentally deregulated, much less than anything that's being described right now under network neutrality, just basic interconnect requirements. He took the idea to Capitol Hill. Capitol Hill's response was, hell no. How are we going to raise money from the telecoms if we deregulate them? So the picture here is the scope of regulation in part depends upon the ability of the regulators to pull the chains of the people they are regulating to bring the money into the system so that they can raise the money they need to get back into office. Simpler people would call this extortion, but in Washington they have much more sophisticated ways for thinking about these problems. But that's a dynamic that extends the reach of government. So if you're a libertarian or someone from the right who wants a smaller government, recognize you're fighting against this built-in bias in favor of more regulation that's necessary to produce the funds necessary to get people back into office. Or think about, again, copyright. I think everybody should recognize, not that we need to abolish copyright, that would be a terrible mistake, but that copyright law needs to be radically updated to make it make sense in a digital environment. The architecture of copyright makes no sense in the context of the architecture of digital technologies. That's not to say that there's no different architecture that would make sense. I think there is, but we need to update to that. But of course, Congress has done literally nothing to facilitate that update. What they've instead done is, pushed by Hollywood interests, push ever more extreme regulation that cements an old model against the potential of the new. So that's this much regulation, and then this little regulation. So inability to get anything to address global warming, the inability, as we saw yesterday, to get anything to address the financial services sector. These are all products of the fact that the status quo has the power to block any new reform. Now, people say to me, well, what about healthcare? Doesn't healthcare show that Barack has changed DC? Ezra Klein, a person who I respect enormously, wrote this piece after the healthcare bill was passed, talking about the twilight of the interest groups. As he put it, the Obama administration succeeded at neutralizing every single industry. Now, I wish Ezra were right, but in fact, I believe Glenn Greenwald has the better read on this story. As he put it, if by neutralizing Ezra means bribing and accommodating them to such an extreme degree that they ended up affirmatively supporting a bill that lavishes them with massive benefits, then he's absolutely right. But being able to force the government to bribe and accommodate you is not a reflection of your powerlessness. Quite the opposite. And to pretend that this bill represents the twilight of the interest groups, that special interests have been neutralized, is just hagiography and propaganda. The way this bill has been shaped is the ultimate expression and bolstering of how Washington has long worked. One can find reasonable excuses for why it had to be done that way, but one cannot reasonably deny that it was. Reminding me of the most important philosopher of the 20th century next to Ludwig Wittgenstein, David Bowie. The system is the same as it ever was, even under this extraordinary innovator called Obama. The status quo gets to stall reform every single time, and this insane policy effect is therefore everywhere across the scope of our policy. Okay, so let me end with a question of what we can do about this. And I want to talk about two things we can do. Number one, in the context of IP debates, by which I mean both IP in the sense of Internet Protocol and IP in the sense of intellectual property. So in the context of Internet Protocol, the Internet debates, what we need is people like you, people who know something about the technology and how innovation gets built on top of this technology, pushing for competition. The monopoly strategy has been tried. We gave them a decade. It has failed. And we need to return to both inter and intra-infrastructure competition, meaning competition within a particular infrastructure, DSL or cable, and competition between the infrastructures, cable, DSL, wireless. Every one of our competitors around the world has adopted that policy, and they beat us every single time because they produce better broadband because of it. And then in the context of IP debates in the sense of copyright, I think what people like you need to help us do is push for a general peace here. Right? We've been waging this war in the context of copyright, what we call the copyright wars, what my friend, the late Jack Valenti, head of the Motion Picture Association, used to refer to as his own, quote, terrorist war, where apparently the terrorists in this war are our children. We've been waging this war for a decade, and we've seen no substantial decline in the number of people using digital technologies to engage in illegal activity. And so what we need to do when we wage a war that is failing is to sue for peace and find a different way to achieve the objectives that that war sought. And in particular, what people like you need to help us do is to convince policymakers of a number of facts that none of us can deny. We can't kill this technology, we can only criminalize it. We're not going to stop our kids from being creative in the way at least I was not creative growing up. We can only drive that creativity underground. We're not going to make them passive. We can only make them, quote, pirates. And the question we need to ask is that any good? Our kids live in this age of prohibitions, constantly living their life in all sorts of contexts of their life against the law. And that experience is deeply corrosive and deeply corrupting of the rule of law in a democracy. And we need to get politicians to focus on that cost as much as they want to focus on the cost to the recording industry. And then number two, we have to think about changes in the context of democracy. Now, this is a poet you didn't think you knew, but you do know him. His name is Martin Niemöller. He was a German pastor born in the late part of the 19th century. In 1946, he began uttering a poem that you all know. He would say, first they came for the communists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jew, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. Now, what Niemöller is pointing to is a certain kind of insight, what we could think of as a core of intelligence. Other creatures have this insight. Ants, red ants in particular, seem to have it. You step on one part of a red ant colony and quickly they swarm and attack you because they recognize they're a threat, as I've discovered a number of times. I'm not sure cows have that insight. I think you can tip cows without there being much consequence. So the point is there's a test here whether you can recognize an underlying cause threatening you and respond. Can you see a pattern and do something about it? Thoreau said it was rare. He said, for every 1,000 hacking at the leaves of evil, there is just one striking at the root. So is it possible here for us to recognize this underlying cause and do something about it? And indeed, for people who were caught up in the romance of this most recent election, I confess I was one of those people, and we think about the range of issues that we thought this new administration would bring some sanity to, there's increasingly, we're recognizing a similar Niemöllerian insight. We could remix his poem like this. First, they slowed healthcare reform, and I did not speak out because I had healthcare. Then they stopped global warming legislation. I did not speak out because global warming really isn't my issue. Then they stopped the regulation of the financial sector, and I did not speak out because maybe it would hurt my 401k. Then they blocked food safety laws, and I did not speak out because I like cheap beef. Then they came for my issue, and there was no one left to speak out for it, or maybe more accurately, there was no lobbyist to hire to speak out for it. The point is we need to recognize there is a pattern here and an underlying cause. And the question is whether we are going to respond more like the cows or the ants, whether we're going to be recognizing the underlying cause or oblivious to this underlying evil and do something about it to stop it. Now, this cause is the economy of influence that affects policy right now, producing this marionette Congress. And the only way to do something about it is to follow an idea presented first by a Republican 102 years ago, Teddy Roosevelt, when he called for what we could call citizen-funded elections. And the latest version of this idea is a system that says voluntarily members would opt into a system where they accepted small dollar contributions only. The bill that's pushing this now, Larson-Jones, Fair Elections Now Act, which has about 150 co-sponsors in the House today, would say that for every party opting in, they would accept a limit of $100 from any citizen, and that would then be matched so that it's worth $500 in actual contributions. So you would take no more than $100, no money from PACs, no money from any other source, but $100 from every citizen. And according to the numbers estimated on the model of what was raised in 2008, that would produce more money than is raised in the political system right now. And the point is to see that with this system of funding, no one could believe that money was buying the results. With this system of funding, we could all believe, as we want to believe, that for whatever stupid reason Congress did what they did, maybe because there were too many Republicans or too many Democrats, the one reason we would not think is that they did the stupid thing they did because of the money. And what this then would do is give us an opportunity to restore confidence and the possibility for trust. Now, what I think we need here is this understanding and an ability to help others to see this Niemöllerian insight too. Because if the right to innovate is to be protected in places like this valley, then that change has to happen. Indeed, if democracy is to be restored anywhere in this country, this change has to happen. Thank you very much.
Okay.